Yeah. Out of the box, pronounced it correctly. They used to call it Kahan, which was wishful thinking on his part.
You know, it's better if you probably sit, because I'll do 2 minutes of introduction. And actually, I need Ed because he's going to. If everyone could please take a seat, we'll get started in just a moment. Wow, these Torresdale people, they actually pay attention. They're not like those city folk. This is great. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to beautiful Torresdale and this great piece of property of the Union League of Philadelphia. So tonight's program is one of the several programs that we'll be doing during the summer months. The next one actually will be on August 15th, where the topic will be Shark Attack of 1916. And there's a Union League story. In fact, the Union League is central to this story. So if you want to be scared and want to never go in the water again, watch this and then watch the movie that was based on this, which is Jaws, which is true. So that is on August 15th. And then September 14th, we're going to kick off a fantastic year of programs, including lectures, a new exhibit, which you'll hear about in a little bit, and civics education programs, scholarships. And September 14th, we'll have a celebration, which kind of previews all that. And if you don't get an invitation in the next few weeks, you should talk to Kristen Moran. Kristen's back there. I think you all know Kristen. And she will explain to you how you can get an invitation to the September 14th event. And just spoiler alert, she's the Director of Development. So that should give you a preview of how to get invited. And that leads me to the next point. Everything that we do, all of our civics education programs, our scholarships, our exhibits, our lecture programs, all that we do, and we do so much to espouse the great values of this institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, is made possible through voluntary support, almost entirely through our members. So for those of you who have supported us and continue to support us, thank you. And for those of you who do not yet support us, I look forward to talking to you about that. And I thank you in advance for your generous support. So tonight's Civil War Roundtable will be about an hour long, as most of our programs are. It will include a Q&A. We are Zooming and streaming live, so you will use the microphone. I'll facilitate that. And we've been having problems on this point, so I want to make it more strongly today. Really, 3 or 4 sentences. And Ed and John, where are you back there? When I go like that, they're done. Okay. We've had several statements and lectures that have happened over the last couple of lectures, and we really want to hear from Paul and his answers. So please try to keep them a couple sentences with a question mark. And now to introduce our program, Ed Trzanski, who is one of the great leaders of the Legacy Foundation and the Union League, a member of our board of trustees, a frequent speaker at such programs, and the senior advisor to the president at Jefferson University Health. To introduce our program, Ed Trzanski. Ed.
I must say, when I heard John talk about that shark attack discussion, I thought, okay, what's next? Hurricanes, landslides, somewhere we're always going to find a Union League connection to talk about something. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Kahan. Paul is the executive director of the American Helicopter Museum, which sounds like a place I would want to spend a week at. It just sounds like a really neat place. He's a leading expert on U.S. political, economic, and diplomatic history, with a particular interest in the half century between Andrew Jackson's election to the presidency in 1828 and the so-called end of Reconstruction in 1877. Paul is the author of several books. They include Eastern State Penitentiary, A History, Amiable Scoundrel, Simon Cameron Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War Legacy, and The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and the Fight for American Finance. Tonight marks the third time Paul has spoken under the banner of the Legacy Foundation, Civil War Roundtable. And his presentation is based, and this evening, his presentation is based on his work, as John referenced, as the curator of the next fantastic exhibit that we're going to have in the Sir John Templeton Heritage Center, entitled Philadelphia and the Civil War. That exhibit will open in October. Paul earned his MA in Modern American History and Literature from Drew University and BAs in History and English from Alfred University. And under pain of torture, Mr. Miko wants me to say, most importantly, he is a graduate of LaSalle College High School. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the microphone, Mr. Paul Kahan.
So much. Appreciate it. You know, I'd like to believe that John selected me for developing this exhibit because of my deep knowledge on the subject, but it is entirely possible that it's because I'm a LaSalle High grad. That's literally my credential. I want to reinforce what John said. My parole officer wants me home by 8:30, so keep it short. You know, how many of you have seen me speak before? Fantastic. So I can use all the same jokes that I use all the time. I really want to appreciate Ed for that warm introduction, John for his great introduction, and for the opportunity to work on this. What they didn't mention is that I'm currently working on a book about the history of Philadelphia. And so this exhibit came up at just the right moment in my scholarly pursuits and kind of dovetails with some of the work that I have been working on. At the same time, it was really fascinating to get to see the Union League's really unique collection. And tonight we're going to talk in sort of broad strokes about this exhibit, but I really want to recommend that you come see it when it's installed, because you will see, and I've been doing this now most of my adult life, which is like 5 years. The Union League collection is really unparalleled, and there are things in there that I had never seen. And we have worked very, very assiduously to bring those out so that when you come to the exhibit, it's not the same old Civil War exhibit. There's going to be a lot of really, really cool stuff. And that's only, I guess, if you're a history nerd, but given the fact that you're all here tonight when you could be somewhere else, I assume that's the case for most of you. By the way, as a former classroom teacher, the fact that all of you are clustered in the back and there are empty seats in the front is really kind of questionable. I don't know what's going on. Do you think I'm going to bite you? I promise you I won't. John still has not signed my last check. So the exhibit is titled A City Divided, the Civil War, Philadelphia, and the Union League. And we titled that because division, tension, conflict are really at the heart of this exhibit. It is an exhibit that is heavily focused on place, that place being Philadelphia, which I think of as a great laboratory for understanding U.S. history. And most important, the role of the Union League in this profoundly transformational moment in Philadelphia's history and in the history of the United States. And I would argue that that is a role that has largely gone unexamined, uncommented upon, but there is a profound political, social, cultural, and economic transformation that takes place between the mid-1850s and the mid-1870s. And much of that transformation can be laid at the feet of the Union League and its members and the roles that they assumed in stewarding the United States through the fight for the Union, and then answering the profound questions that were raised by the Civil War and its aftermath. What do you think, John? Is that enough Union League?
That's good Union League stuff.
Good Union League stuff. All right. So I want to start at the beginning. And when you come to the exhibit, the exhibit is not shy about the conflict between America's founding ideals as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and its original sin, that of slavery. There is no way to escape the conflict between a nation committed to the idea that all men are born and equal, when much of the wealth and status and power in this country is derived from the enslavement of Africans. And in fact, at one point in the exhibit, we actually asked the question, was the Constitution an anti-slavery document? And this is a debate that, of course, is raging in the public right now as we are dealing with the controversy, for lack of a better word, of the 1619 Project and the scholarly answers to it. And from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of the Heritage Foundation, is that the Constitution is a document that has profound compromises that were necessary in order to get its ratification. And those compromises lead to, over time, two divergent interpretations of the document, a pro-slavery and an anti-slavery interpretation. And those divergent interpretations are really at the heart of the breakdown of political order in the 1850s and the emergence of the Civil War. And of course, you can't talk about those documents and really even slavery without talking about Philadelphia. Both of those documents were drafted in Philadelphia. Both of those documents reflected the very temperate political environment of Philadelphia, which was between the hotbed New England colonies and the more loyalist South. Philadelphia provided a unique environment for thinking about these ideals, gestating on these ideals, and ultimately became a base of implementing them as the first capital of the United States. And again, this gets back to one of the key elements of this exhibit, which is this idea of place. Philadelphia as a unique place, and of course, the Union League's unique role in that political environment. And that, of course, brings us to Philadelphia, a divided city. And what you're looking at are, I think, two images that sum up really in stark terms the very complex relationship that Philadelphia and Pennsylvania have to the institution of slavery. How many of you were aware that the first petition against slavery was drafted in Philadelphia in 1688? Okay, so a very small minority. The house that you're looking at is in Germantown. That picture dates the 18th century, but that document that you see is the 1688 Germantown Protest against slavery. It's a fairly limited protest. It's drafted by Quakers. It is aimed particularly at Quakers, but nonetheless, it is the first time that a group of people got together and put their opposition to African slavery in writing. At the same time, in 1838, you have the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, a building that was constructed specifically so that abolitionists could have a platform for speaking in what was then the print and media capital of the United States. It's really a stark contrast when you look at the outbreaks of anti-Black terrorism that take place in the 1830s and the 1840s, to remember that this was a city with a long history of abolitionist sentiment. And in fact, the consolidation in 1854 of the outlying areas into the city of Philadelphia owes much to concerns about the persistent violence, much of it anti-Black, some of it anti-Catholic, in the 30s and the 40s. So rather than being a footnote, rather than being a sideshow, in fact, the conflict over slavery and over the divergent interpretations of the founding principles and the founding documents is at the heart of Philadelphia's history. You really can't understand the development of the city without understanding that profound tension. Does that make sense? Okay. You're all kind of looking at me stone-faced. I don't know if I've lapsed into Latin or something else. I feel like if some of you were sitting closer, this would be easier. I don't know. I see some of you with wine. I hope you brought enough for the rest of the class. Of course, a city divided plays upon one of Lincoln's best known sound bites, a house divided. Lincoln, the presidential election of 1860 and the Secession Crisis deals with the events in that 6-month period between the presidential election and Lincoln's inauguration, where the country slides into first a political crisis and then ultimately into military conflict. And one of the things that the exhibit suggests, and that I've come to understand developing this exhibit, is the degree to which Lincoln was an expert. I mean, he was really quite good at mobilizing American history in his calls to support the Union. I mean, when you think about his inaugural address, and he talks about the mystic chords of memory. I mean, this is a man whose pitch to the seceded states is grounded in that shared experience of US history. Prior to taking the oath of office, Lincoln, of course, travels from Springfield through various cities, sort of ginning up support for or trying to deflate the secessionist movement. And one of his most famous stops is here in Philadelphia, where he stands in front of Independence Hall and raises the flag of the United States with all of its stars in place. It's a profound statement about first the invalidity of secession, but also the power of these historical symbols to strengthen the ties that bind the Union together. And it is absolutely no exaggeration to say that he couldn't have done that anywhere else than Philadelphia. Because when it comes to it, pound for pound, ounce for ounce, Philadelphia's collection of revolutionary sites and revolutionary artifacts outpaces any other place in the United States. If you want to make this kind of appeal, if this kind of appeal is going to be at the heart of your attempt to bind the Union together, there is no place other than Philadelphia that can be made. And I would argue there's no place other than Independence Hall that it can be made. And in fact, Lincoln says specifically, all the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, so far as I have been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated and were given to the world from this hall. He grounds his political philosophy specifically in those documents that we discussed and in the anti-slavery reading of those documents, which is key. That is the philosophical, that is the political, that is the legal basis on which Lincoln is operating. And it originates here in Philadelphia. Now, I tend to think of Philadelphia as a sort of bookend to Lincoln's presidency. He's here mere days before he takes the oath of office, and he returns, unfortunately, mere days after his assassination. And his body is displayed at Independence Hall for mourners. Now, it's a profoundly different Philadelphia that he will return to in 1865 than the one he visits in 1861. Philadelphia in 1861 is, as I have suggested, a divided city, a city with secessionists, with supporters of the southern states for a variety of economic, cultural, and political reasons, and staunch unionists. And ultimately, it will be those staunch Unionists who will go on to mobilize as members of the Union League, to mobilize political support, economic support, in a variety of different ways in support both of the Lincoln administration and of the Union cause. And of course, in 1861, Lincoln is ultimately unable to bring the seceded states back into the Union. They defy federal law. And so in April, he calls up 75,000 troops, which is an astonishing increase in the size of the army. I like to tell people when I talk about my book on Simon Cameron, who was Lincoln's first Secretary of War and a League member. I was getting to that, although I'm not sure you want to claim him. That is another lecture. When Cameron assumed the War Department, the United States Army was 15,000 men weak, and most of those were out west picking fights with Native Americans. Lincoln is demanding a five-fold increase in the size of the military, and he's demanding it yesterday. And there are all of these complicated ways in which people can join up, and there's conflict between the states and the local organizations. If you want to hear that story, make John bring me back. I'll talk about it as part of my Cameron book. But what I want to suggest here is that, again, Philadelphia provides a really important symbol and rallying point for the supporters of Union. And so you have the two lithographs there. One you can see is troops marching in front of Independence Hall. And I know it's kind of hard to see that, but those are Zouave troops who improbably went into battle wearing bright red parachute pants. They look like they're from a 1990s rap video, and these very light blue shirts. And they were named after, I kid you not, they were modeled upon French soldiers who served in the Middle East. So they had these very light uniforms, lightweight uniforms that were designed to be easily seen in the desert. You can imagine how well that went over in battles at like Ball's Bluff. Right? You don't want to be seen. You do want to blend in. You don't want to look like a background dancer for a Janet Jackson video. But there they were, marching in front of Independence Hall. And in fact, there was a recruiting camp, Camp William Penn, in the backyard area of Independence Hall, because it was recognized that where you sign people up, where you establish these recruiting centers is just as important as that you establish these recruiting centers. And again, Philadelphia could be mobilized for these purposes. Its very existence, its very symbols, its very buildings could be mobilized as part of a patriotic appeal. And leading the charge, of course, was the Union League, which recruited several regiments throughout the war. You can see a list of them in there. And I promise when it comes to the exhibit, this will be printed much better, so you will actually be able to read it. Now you're feeling bad about sitting in the back of the room, aren't you? Should have brought the reading glasses. The Union League starts out renting a mansion and eventually moves to the new Union League house, which opens in 1865. And I just learned recently that that building was never dedicated, because Lincoln himself was supposed to come and dedicate the building. And of course, unfortunately, he was assassinated shortly before he was able to do that. But it gives you a sense, I think, of just how important the Union League was, that the President of the United States would come to dedicate its building. A recognition of the key role that it played, not only in mobilizing individuals to support the Union cause via the military, but also through economic appeals, through support on the home front in terms of volunteerism. It's impossible to understate the degree to which the Union Leagues plays a role in winning the war, particularly here in Philadelphia. And now I want to turn to some of the specifics of the role that it plays. One is, of course, political. Philadelphia, after consolidation, was a deeply divided city politically. You had a large contingent of Whigs in what we now think of as Fairmount, Spring Garden, in South Philadelphia, what we think of as Franklin's Philadelphia, the blocks between Vine Street and South Street between the rivers, was largely a Democratic enclave. And in fact, consolidation took decades because neither the Whigs nor the Democrats wanted to lose political power. They recognized that once those townships were incorporated into Philadelphia, there would be a scramble for power, there would be a reallocation of political power, and ultimately neither saw the advantage in that. It's only with the profound concerns over violence that you find the political wherewithal to be able to achieve consolidation. In addition, Philadelphia is economically and culturally tied to the South. There is a portion of Chestnut Street that is called Carolina Row because of the number of South Carolinians who maintain mansions here in the city. Have any of you ever heard of Fanny Campbell? This is great. No one's answering my questions. This is fantastic. You guys are making me feel very, very smart. Fanny Campbell was an English actress who married a dashing, wealthy, and handsome South Carolinian plantation owner. And that's where the wheels came right off the wagon. Pierce Butler was a slave owner. And when they returned to his plantation, she got a firsthand view of the horrors of plantation life and ended up divorcing Butler over it. They met in Philadelphia while she was touring as part of this theater company and married here. He was just one of many Southerners who were linked to this city. And they were linked to this city because Philadelphia was a banking capital, it was an insurance capital, it was a shipping capital, and it was a railroad hub. If you wanted to go north from Washington, D.C. to Massachusetts, guess what city you were passing through? If you wanted to go from Washington, D.C. west to Illinois, guess where you were passing through? And most likely, if you wanted to sell your cotton or have it transformed into textiles, guess where you were sending it? Here to Philadelphia. And all you need to do is take a ride along the Schuylkill Expressway and look over toward Manayunk to see the ruins of that textile industry, which processed millions of bales of slave-grown cotton and connected this city to the South. So when the war breaks out, there are people whose pocketbooks are going to be hurt. There are people whose businesses are going to be destroyed if they can't get cotton, if they can't collect insurance premiums. And they are pressuring the Lincoln administration not to force the Southern states to secede, or excuse me, to come back into the Union. They are pressuring the Lincoln administration to find a peaceful accommodation. But very quickly, the political culture of the city shifts. And that's why I included one of my favorite political cartoons. The gentleman that you see in front of you is shaking his hand at a copperhead. And by copperhead, we mean a Northern Democrat who supported peace at any cost. And what this old man is saying is, and it's clear that he's lost his son in the war, and this is 1862, he says, "I hate you more than I hate the Confederate who killed my boy." Think about that for a second. Think about how angry, how devastated people living in the city are. I hate the copperhead in my backyard more than I hate the Confederate. They don't know any better. You should. And it basically leads to the collapse of the Democratic Party in Philadelphia. A Democratic Party that heretofore had largely controlled what we think of as Franklin's Philadelphia. Philadelphia would be a one-party state from the 1860s through the 1930s. And it's only the New Deal that decimates the Republican machine of the city and replaces it with a Democratic machine. Incidentally, if you want information about that, check out Amiable Scoundrel, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War. Because, that was a joke, none of you laughed. I didn't make John lock the doors until you agree to buy the book. So meet me halfway here. Because, of course, the leader of the Republican Party in Pennsylvania is Simon Cameron. And he spends a lot of his time here in the city, making sure that the political machine, the Republican machine in the city works and is well functioning. But you can see the role that is played by the Union League. This is a broadside that is published in 1863 in the lead up to the invasion of Pennsylvania by forces under Robert E. Lee's command. The city basically loses its mind, sure that Lee is going to march on Philadelphia. And the reason for that is simple. If Lee had taken Philadelphia, he would have effectively cut off communication between the nation's capital and the rest of the Union. There were no other train lines. He would have cut the telegraph lines. And basically, you would have had a national capital operating deep in enemy territory. It was therefore only logical to conclude that Lee's next stop was Philadelphia. And so what you get is an attempt to build up militia forces to protect the city, to mobilize for the city's defense, to augment the troops fighting in Gettysburg. And the circles that you see, and these are all depictions based on actual scenes that happen, the circles that you see depict Union League banners. The Union League was at the forefront of this effort, not only to defend the city, but also to send temporary troops out to Gettysburg to repel Lee's invasion. And that was not just a measure of self-interest. That was a recognition that as goes Gettysburg, so goes the war. And so as a result, we see the Union League playing these incredibly important roles. But again, it's not just on the military side. Because Philadelphia was a railroad hub, it was the ideal location for evacuating wounded prisoners. And so we get the creation of the largest the largest hospitals in Civil War America here in Philadelphia, in Germantown, and in South Philadelphia. They are largely organized by volunteers. And many of those volunteers were Union League members or the wives of Union League members. Because again, remember the position the federal government finds itself in when the war breaks out. The federal government was never designed to prosecute a war the size, the scale, the duration of the Civil War. And it stumbles in 61 and 62, and even to a certain extent in 63, to be able to develop into an organization that can do that. Volunteers fill that vacuum. Volunteer recruiters, volunteer nurses. And in perhaps one of the most important aspects, volunteers at the refreshment saloons. The refreshment saloons were places where soldiers could do laundry, get a meal, get a drink, crash for a few hours. And they were located on Washington Avenue because that's where the trains came into Philadelphia. And those trains would disgorge soldiers on their way south to fight. Many of these men had never been more than a few miles from the places where they were born. And here they were in a strange city where they knew no one. They likely had no money in their pockets, going to do this incredibly daunting thing. And volunteers, hundreds of them, gave these individuals, gave these soldiers just a little bit of comfort, a little bit of support, and a recognition that there were people that had their backs, that there were people who supported them. And they did this entirely voluntarily. The federal government didn't have the time, the money, or the resources to support anything like this. It was all volunteers. And in fact, I happened to be down at the Union League house, the Union League building yesterday, going through artifacts. And in fact, there's a print that's not quite the same as this, but depicts the same type of thing. And there is a list down the names of the people who were involved. And I recognize several Union League members. And I am awaiting an email from Jim on just how many of those were Union League members. Not to call you out, Jim, just a reminder. Perhaps the most important voluntary aspect or event here in the city was the Great Sanitary Fair, which was essentially a World's Fair held in Logan Square in the summer of 1864. It was an attempt to raise funds for the Union war effort. There were sanitary fairs throughout the United States, but Philadelphia's was the largest and the most profitable. And here again, Abraham Lincoln came to this fair at the invitation of the fair organizers, many of whom were Union League or Union League affiliated. And he auctioned off several copies of the Emancipation Proclamation that he had signed. The copies were printed, but he had hand signed them. If you come to the exhibit, you will see George Boker's copy, which is held in the Union League archive. It has pride of place in our exhibit. And it gives us an opportunity to ask a question about Lincoln's legacy. Was Lincoln the great emancipator? Did the Emancipation Proclamation, which of course at the moment it was signed, referred only to states that were in rebellion and therefore not answering the federal law, did that actually earn for Lincoln the title of great emancipator? Now, I'm not going to answer that question for you because I want you to come to the exhibit. But I can guarantee you're going to see a lot of other cool things that will help you get a perspective on that question. And again, where else but Philadelphia, with its long history of volunteer culture, with its strong resources, transportation, printing, mass media, and a powerful group of union sponsors, could something like this have taken place? I would argue nowhere. I would argue this event, the largest and most profitable of the sanitary fairs, is proof positive that Philadelphia holds pride of place when it comes to support of the union's efforts, and that is due largely to the efforts of the Union League and its members. Now, of course, the story ends sadly, devastatingly, as a matter of fact. Abraham Lincoln, after leading the nation through war, the most devastating war in the nation's history, by some measures, even the most devastating today, is gunned down as he sits enjoying a moment of levity at Ford's Theater. But here again, we see deep Philadelphia connections. The gun, you know what? I knew I was going to mess it up, and here it is. It was going so smoothly. All right, we should just start over again. How do I get backwards? There we go. The gun that Booth used was a Derringer. It was likely produced in what is today Northern Liberties by Derringer, whose factory was part of his house. You'll be able to see a reproduction of it in the exhibit. The original is at Ford's Theater. You'll be able to see a scrap of the shirt that Lincoln was wearing the night that he was assassinated. Perhaps most interestingly, as a Philadelphia connection, the hearse in which Lincoln was carried, not only through Philadelphia, but I've come to learn in other cities, was built by an undertaker here in Philadelphia, a guy by the name of Edward S. Early, who has a fascinating side story all his own. He developed a technique for refrigerating corpses that allowed them to keep longer. And when Harrison died, I think it's Harrison, he was called in to develop that funeral, in part because he had experience conducting the funeral of Abraham Lincoln, and he became known as the undertaker to presidents, which is a weird thing to drop at a cocktail party, but you go with what you got to have. Lincoln's, and as you can see, the absolute adoration of the crowd. This is a far cry from a city that in 1861 had a secessionist newspaper, the Palmetto Flag, that was putting out issues calling on the Lincoln administration to end the war on whatever terms possible. This is a far cry from 1864 when a Philadelphia native, George McClellan, would run against Lincoln and demand an immediate end of the war. And Lincoln was convinced he would lose. Lincoln actually convenes a cabinet meeting and says, it's likely I'll lose. And that means we got to wrap the war up in the time between the election and McClellan's inauguration. Think about that as a commitment to the founding documents. and the belief that even in wartime, even as it threatens the very survival of the Union, we still have to have a presidential election, and we still have to abide by the results. And one of the questions that the exhibit asks is, can a democracy fight a war? And there are several instances where Lincoln's experience calls that into question. And there are several instances where the Lincoln administration demonstrates, yes, it can. And that to me is Lincoln's finest moment. I mean, you want to talk to me about great things about Lincoln? The fact that in 1864, he remained committed to standing for re-election in the middle of a devastating and unpopular war, that says something about his commitment to the documents that were drafted and signed in Philadelphia. Of course, unfortunately, Lincoln dies without a firm plan for Reconstruction, or I should say, without a plan for Reconstruction that has buy-in from all elements of the Republican Party. The Civil War raises some really profound questions about what happens next. Yes, slavery is abolished, but what does that mean in practice? Does that imply social, political, economic, and cultural equality between white and black? What does the United States owe the formerly enslaved? How do we bring former Confederates back into the United States, and on what terms? And these are all questions that get asked in Reconstruction. In fact, Reconstruction is a prolonged debate about the answers to those very questions. And that is most definitely a topic for another lecture and another exhibit. But I want to end with a really profound statement that Frederick Douglass makes. In 1862, Frederick Douglass comes to Philadelphia and says, "Hey, I have never seen a city more racist." Now I'm paraphrasing, but not by much. He says, anti-black prejudice is worse in Philadelphia than anywhere I've ever been. And this is a man who grew up in slavery. He knew from what he spoke. 4 years later, he recalls, "We were marching through a city remarkable for the depth and bitterness of its hatred of the abolition movement, a city whose populace had mobbed anti-slavery meetings, burned temperance halls and churches owned by colored people, and burned down Pennsylvania Hall because it had opened its doors to the people of different colors upon terms of equality. But now the children of those who had committed those outrages and follies were applauding the very principles which their fathers had condemned." Philadelphia underwent a sea change during the course of the war, and no organization played a greater or more important role in affecting that change than the Union League of Philadelphia. And with that, I stand open for cross-examination. No, wait, I stand open for questioning.
Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. And we will entertain questions. Oh, I have so many, but I was going to. Questions? No, yes, right here, Jim. If you would use the microphone, please.
What was a sanitary fair?
That's a fantastic question. So a sanitary fair on paper was just an opportunity to raise money for nurses and hospitals and the treatment of soldiers. But why you would go there was because there would be art on display and new inventions and sculpture, and people would actually set up booths with historical reenactments. The pictures from it are absolutely wild. I mean, the screenshot that I showed doesn't really do it justice. Oh, I'm not supposed to wander. But it's massive. It is on a massive scale. When you consider these are the people, and you compare that to the size of the building and the various halls, you can get a sense of just how much was on offer. And you would pay admission. And of course, there would be celebrity guests. You would get an opportunity to see Abraham Lincoln. You would get an opportunity to hopefully win a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. Does that answer your question? Thank you for that question. Yes, go ahead. Kira will give you the microphone.
So the Union League, we all have a much better understanding of the role that we've played or the league played. Was there a club or an organization for the Southern sympathizers?
So actually, the Union League is on some level formed as a reaction to attempts to build political support for such an organization. It's formed shortly after the midterm elections of 1862, when there is a recognition that the Lincoln administration needs political support. And one of the most important things that the Union League does is develop a very, very aggressive pamphleteering operation that is designed to provide what we would call talking points in support of Lincoln administration policies. So yes, there is, but in this city, the Democrats are on the losing side of that argument, in large part because the costs of the war are so obvious to begin with. And particularly initially, before it becomes a war to end slavery, when it's a war to save the Union, that is an easy sell. After 1863, it becomes a different kind of conflict. But early on in the war, it's an easy sell. And it's interesting because, and I'm going to go kind of outside the box here, but I would highly recommend reading James McPherson's book, For Cause and Comrades, because he talks about the various reasons for which soldiers served in the war. And sometimes it's as simple as, I want to impress a girl. Sometimes it's as simple as, I want to see the world. And sometimes it's a rock-rib commitment to either the Union or to abolition. But whatever your reason going in, to see the Peace Democrats calling for the end of the war on any terms, right, is deeply, deeply alarming. And so the attempt, I would argue, to mobilize support for those kinds of policies actually becomes its own, becomes self-defeating, if that makes sense. And after 1863, the Democrats really can't quite get it together. And that becomes the defining characteristic of the Democratic Party, really until the reshuffling of political alliances during the New Deal, which is its own fascinating story and one well worth telling.
Dr. Dorsham.
Much of human nature and Philadelphia politics is what's in it for me. What was in it for the volunteer colored troops?
There was a lot in it. I mean, there was a recognition that they had something to prove. There was a recognition that once the war was over, the questions that I raised about Reconstruction were going to need to be answered. And that the best way to dispel the pernicious and racist beliefs that even some abolitionists held was to demonstrate that you were the equal of, and in many cases, the superior to any white man in the field. And so I think that there was that. There was a humanitarian aspect. I mean, you know, Martin Luther King 100 years later would tell us that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And again, I'm probably mangling that quote, but not by much. And I think that there was a recognition of that. And I think that the place that I would look to that is the writings of Frederick Douglass, who starts out taking a very pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. He's very bearish on the Constitution. Look at his speech on July 4th in 1852. What is July 4th to the black man? And he basically says, it's nothing. I am excluded, right? And so is every black man. When the framers talked about all men, they were not talking about us. But what he recognizes is, and this is how he comes around to the pro-slavery interpretation or the anti-slavery interpretation, he realizes the same mechanisms that can be used to perpetuate slavery can be used to destroy slavery. But in order to do that, you have to engage, and you have to engage at every level. And it becomes a very, very effective tool for doing that. Even among free blacks, people who had never been enslaved, people who had never been South, people who had no relations in the South, they recognized a shared interest. And it's not overstatement to say that free black soldiers provide an incredibly important tool of victory. In fact, there are some who say the 200,000 that serve provide the Union with the margin of victory.
Jim, question in the back.
What was the ethnic makeup of Philadelphia at this time, given that it was pre-19th century, the Italians, the Jews who had emigrated here?
So Philadelphia was among the most ethnically and racially diverse cities in the United States at this time. You had a large number in the 18th century, it had been primarily English, Welsh, and German immigration. That changes in the 19th century. You start getting more Irish, which initially is Irish Protestants, later becomes Irish Catholics. And that's where you get a lot of the anti-Catholic terrorism of the 30s and the 40s. But Philadelphia also had a very large free Black population. In fact, it may well have had the largest free Black population in the North. Somewhere it's in my book, and that's why you write these things down, so that you don't have to remember them. But certainly it was the most ethnically and racially diverse city at the turn of the 19th century, and that trend continues well into the 19th. My only skepticism would be how New York becomes New York is the construction of the Erie Canal, which opens in 1825, and basically means that it becomes easier to transport goods from all across the United States into Manhattan, which has a much easier access to the Atlantic Ocean. Prior to that, Philadelphia had been the leading port in North America. And so what that does is kind of open the floodgates. But Philadelphia had been the port of call for white Frenchmen escaping the Haitian Revolution, and then Black Haitians. So it had a very large and diverse ethnic and racial makeup, much more so than I think you might imagine prior to the waves of Southern European immigrants in the 1870s and 80s.
Kira, question in the back.
I'm a grade school teacher, so I'm always kind of coming at this stuff from the perspective
Come on,
of my
give her a
kids.
hand. That's the hardest job imaginable.
When we're talking about the Civil War, I mean, we're really talking about a period of like 5-6 years that the war is actually occurring. So when you're saying that Philadelphia is a city that changed in its sentiment, or like you're giving us that quote from Douglas, where he's saying initially they are, steeped in our connection to the South with the cotton production. And then he notes this change that you reference. Was it really a change in the sentiment of the people living in the city, or was this a difference in those, because he references specifically their children.
Right.
So is this like the people who have lived through the war and seen what has happened and have come to accept, and now they're the ones that are kind of taking control in the city? Is this a difference in age, or was there really a shift in the sentiment of the city overall?
I think there was definitely a shift in the sentiment. Part of it is certainly generational, but it's a relatively small window that you're talking about. Really only about 4 years. So I would argue that it's more individuals, quote unquote, seeing the light. But also, I mean, look, there's also politics involved. There's also self-interest involved. People are recognizing the Republican Party is going to be the dominant political party after the Civil War. And so they're migrating into that party. I mean, there's some opportunism there. There's some principle there. It's a very complicated mix. But nevertheless, from a policy outcome standpoint, you can see a difference. That doesn't mean that everyone's singing Kumbaya and everything's great. We still have anti-Black violence that takes place. We still have anti-Black violence taking place in the city today. But I do think I do perceive a change in perspective. And the other thing is, when I talk about the Civil War era, I tend to think of the Civil War era as going from 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War, through the so-called end of Reconstruction. So there's about a 30-year period where things get really, really weird. My next book is a biography of James Buchanan, who was Lincoln's predecessor. He's generally considered America's worst president. My book will do nothing to dispel that notion. But things get weird. Like, at one point, he sends the army out to beat up Mormons in Utah because he doesn't like polygamy, even while he's like crushing the Democratic Party at home. Like, things get weird. And I think that's part of it too.
Question right here.
Can you comment on the role of Jay Cook, Philadelphian Jay Cook, and his financing of the Civil War?
I can comment on Jay Cook destroying the economy in 1873. and basically largely crippling the Grant administration's efforts at Reconstruction, which has an entire chapter in my book on the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. There is a brand new book out that I wish I had thought of the idea about financing the war, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I suspect Cook is mentioned in there. I mean, if you sit with me at dinner, I could do an hour on the economic history of the United States, ranging from the bank war through, basically how Reconstruction is hobbled by the financial machinations of, the railroads and all that kind of stuff. But in a thumbnail sketch, no, I can't answer that. I would check that book out because I think you'll find a lot in there. He does. I mean, it's amazing what goes on. Can we talk about Salmon Chase for a minute? The Secretary of the Treasury. This dirtbag comes up with all this clever stuff to finance the war, bonds and paper money, and it's great. And then he gets on the Supreme Court and he rules all that stuff illegal. Like, what? What are you doing? And financially, that plays a massive role in curtailing the federal government's ability to protect Blacks in the South in a ways that I think often goes underappreciated. So boo Salmon Chase.
So one quick comment on Jay Cook and the book that you're referencing, and the author is Kira.
Robert Lowenstein.
Thank you, Jim. And you'll see in the banner that he is coming on September 21st to present that book. You will see that in the banner, and it's not true. We had to reschedule, and I tell you that because he will see that in, I think, this month's the August banner or the last one. It was in the last one. And this one. We'll have a great Civil War roundtable. Will not be that subject. We'll have him back. Okay, so we will get there. We have time for one more question, Kira.
Yeah, I guess my question is, do you see any lessons for us today? And I ask because I guess the theme is a city divided in a lot of ways. I think our city or state or country are divided. Like, what's your perspective on what that means today?
Oh, gosh. I wrote a 600-page book about Philadelphia's history to unpack everything I wanted to say about it and how I think it impacts our present. This is probably the hardest question anyone's ever, and I do these all the time. Like, this is the hardest question anyone's ever asked me because I have I have a lot of things to say about that are not necessarily directly related to this exhibit. This exhibit is very much about a very specific set of transformations that take place in Philadelphia, due in overwhelming degree to the efforts of the Union League, both as qua-Union League members and as individuals affiliated with the Union League, kind of supporting the administration in a variety of different ways. So on the one hand, I think it should never blind us to the important role that individuals can play in affecting change, that getting together and being the change that you want to see is really, really important. That being said, the book is about all of these structural factors that limit decisions. And in what is probably the only time this has ever happened at a Union League Civil War roundtable, I'm going to quote Karl Marx, who I'm going to paraphrase Karl Marx. And this is where John's going to pull me off stage. He hasn't fed me yet, so I'm treading very carefully. Marx said something along the lines of, we make history, but in very narrowly confined ways, in circumstances not of our own making. And I think that's true. I think the Union League and its members are able to affect the kind of change they are able to affect because that happens in a very specific moment. And they happen to be in the right place at the right time with the right message in front of an audience that was receptive to hear it. So I don't really feel like I've answered your question. The best thing I can say is read my book, and we'll continue this conversation via email. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Kahan. And we will have you back, Paul. Talk more about that. You should know, and you'll find out at dinner, I actually quote Karl Marx almost every single tour I give of the Evening with Phil. That's true. And so thank you again, Paul. Thank you for being here this evening. Again, August 15th at UL National, the Great Shark Attack of 1916. And then September 14th, we will kick off an incredible programming year. And for your invitation, just check with Kristen Moran and she'll explain how you'll get one. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed it.